Thank you for doing this, DJ. It's been a very long time since we first made contact. I think it was in the early 90s when we were beginning our book, Hot Photography. It was analog days. We were looking at the most appropriate technology at that time to overcome some of the technological barriers that we had. Now, in this digital age, the technologies have moved on, and perhaps a very different technology is appropriate today. But we also did then the famine conference at the Guardian. You came over to Pachala to do the research for your PhD. Then your stay at Dalian, where you tried to get me across. We taught together in Taiwan, and a whole range of things. And of course, your core involvement in the very project that we're doing right now. So I'm very happy and honored to have you as my friend. And of course, you have grown so wonderfully, both as a teacher and as a practitioner, and that's something we don't always have a combination of. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Well, thanks, Shahidul. As always, it's fantastic to have the chance to talk to you. I'm going to share a screen here and, oh, wait, come in. Here we are. So hopefully you can see a photograph here of me. So I call myself a multimedia journalist. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means before we get into the project that we're here to talk about. This is a picture taken in 1993. I think a lot of people think of multimedia journalism as being something quite recent, but it was actually something that I took up very early on when I realized with these small high-8 cameras that I was able to record video and shoot photographs, which was the main thing that I was doing at that time. In this case, I'm covering the Special Olympics for the British team. I'm shooting a BBC package with the video camera, and I have two stills cameras around me. One is for the British team and the other was for the Daily Mail, I think. But it goes back a long time. Now, a lot of people ask me before we start about my name, my DJ name. I'm not a music DJ, but I changed my name, or I used my initials, David James, early on because of the fact that there were other David Clarks around. So this was a guy who was writing books at the time, a very famous wedding photographer who was Dave Clark. And then unfortunately later there was a DJ Clark, a real DJ, but he came too late. By that time I'd already established. And I think you said that when you told people you were going to be talking to me, they said, oh, is that TJ Clark, the art critic? So there's still people that I do. Let me take you through the sort of evolution of my career, which spans 30 years now. I started off like I'm sure you did, Shahidul, with film cameras. In this case, I had a Nikon F3, was my first professional film camera. And then, as I said, when these high-8 cameras came along, they were very small and allowed me to be able to do video packages. And at the time, by that time, I'd moved to being a freelancer, and I was traveling around the world, and I was looking for ways of funding these projects that I wanted to do. I wanted to concentrate on issues and really get into the issue rather than just going from one assignment to the other and spend time in different places doing that. And I found that being able to create video allowed me to find more places to sell content and also to get the issue further afield. I'm going to talk a lot about that later as well. It's one of my key kind of passions is I see myself very much as a journalist more than an artist, though. I mean, obviously there's a fine line in between the two, but in this case, I'm communicating. I see my role as trying to communicate issues, and video very early on, I realized, was extremely powerful. I progressed to digital DSLRs, as we call them. This is the 5D, 5D Mark II. When that first came out, a complete revolution. It meant that I could combine my video camera and stills cameras into one body. It was able to create both. And then, of course, now I'm using the A7R4, I think it is, which is an even smaller package, which means that I'm able to travel much lighter. So this is a picture that gives you an example of myself on assignment for National Geographic. And you can see the size of the kit that I bring is really quite small. But for a typical assignment like this, I'll be shooting stills as well as making video as well, and a little bit of writing. And I can do that with a relatively small sized backpack now, where I can carry all my gear. as is the case here. So what is a multimedia journalist? Well, as I described myself, it's a term that was very popular in its early day, and then suddenly people were saying, well, everyone's a multimedia journalist. It doesn't make much sense, but I still feel value in it, and I define it this way. Well, I define it through my work as a department of everything else, and that means I've worked in TV stations, and I've worked in newspapers and other media organizations. And when I go into that organization, the multimedia department is always the department of the things that they don't do. So in a TV station, it's photography and writing. And then if you go to a newspaper, it's video. It's mainly video, but also doing some online infographics and this kind of thing as well. So it's basically, it's a department of everything that the legacy or the old media department doesn't do anymore. I also like using a very quick sort of introduction to the importance of online, that when you go online, we lose this traditional means of communication from the one to many, as you do with, as I said, the legacy with TV, print and radio, to a very different format of communication. You sort of stand in the middle. And as a multimedia journalist, I see myself very much standing in the middle of a community now, which is my audience. And I'm talking to them and they're talking back to me. And we have a much more, what should I say, collaborative way of creating content, deciding what stories we should do and how we do them. So spending time to listen to the audience, to speak to the audience, to get their point of view, and to also look at their media that they're creating on their devices. Devices now, the ones that I publish on, these are devices that not only can you consume media on, but you can produce media on. And I think that's very important to understand with our audiences, that we produce content, but we also should understand that the audience can also produce content on the same device that they are consuming that on. And again, that sort of changes things. And I like to use two examples that I'm going to do very quickly, because I think this illustrates my understanding of multimedia journalism best. The first comes from a workshop in Langkawi in Malaysia. It was for a group of Asian journalists who've been given a scholarship to come on a one-week multimedia journalism course. And we get off the bus at the airport in Langkawi. We go to the hotel. We go into the foyer. It's one of these open foyers, and this beautiful view at sunset, as I've pictured here. And every one of them, they go straight to their phones. They take pictures of the view, and they upload it to their social media. And yet the next morning, when we start the workshop and I say, you know, what do you do? What's your job? They pretty well all were writers. And they said, well, we're writers. We don't take pictures. And I said, well, I didn't see you rushing to the counter of the gift shop and buying a postcard and writing a description of what you saw last night. I saw you taking a picture. They gravitated to the most logical way of telling that story. And yet in their work, they saw it differently. And you know, what I like to do is to think of myself as somebody who has pretty well as many tools as possible, all the tools that you can tell the story, and that you use the most appropriate one. And the second example I use for that is a party. I like to tell the story of going to a going to meet some old students that I studied with. And before the party, before we get to the party, we haven't seen each other for many years, that everyone talks about it on social media. And the way that they talk about it is with text, because it's the most natural way to say, this party's coming up. I hope you're going to be there. So-and-so is going to be there. We're going to meet at this time. We're going to go to this place. We're going to eat this food or whatever. So we discuss it with text before the party. But as soon as we meet, we start taking photographs of each other, because we haven't seen each other in a long time. And we want to share it with the people who are not there. And the most natural way to do that is to take photographs. And then later on in the party, things get a bit rowdy. People have a few drinks or whatever, and they start doing silly dances. And then people pick up and they start shooting video, because video is the best way to communicate that particular part of this story. And then next morning, they maybe gravitate to other forms of media. But what is happening, and we're all doing this when we're on our social media feeds, is we're gravitating naturally to the most natural way to tell that story, given that the devices that we're using have the possibility of all forms of media. And that's exactly how I see multimedia journalism. You come to a story and you ask yourself immediately, what is the best way I can communicate this to my audience? Not, I'm a photographer, I'm going to take a picture of this, or I'm a videographer, I need to make a video package of it. It's simply asking that first question, here is the story, how can I best tell it when all formats are possible? And of course, with legacy media, we were limited. We were limited to video on TV or to text and photographs on newspapers and of course, audio on radio. But we don't have those limits when we go online. I want to talk next about the film Battleground PolyU, but I'm going to come back to you, Shahidul, now. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that definition and how it has changed in the majority world as well, because this is something that has happened not just in the West, it's happened all over the world with journalists. And I know particularly at Pashala, of course, and your students and the journalists that are working with you in DRIC, that this is very much part of the way that you're thinking.
Yeah, I'd actually like to go back to a conversation I had with Christian Cajol many years ago in Barcelona. Yeah. And we were talking about the fact that had the great Eugene Smith, who was so passionate about his story about Pittsburgh, been around today, whether he would still have told the story in the same way, or whether he, like you and I, would have been a multimedia journalist with a backpack and a smartphone. I mean, he was very passionate about the way his work would be shown. He rejected big contracts because he wasn't happy about the way the publishers would deal with it. But this, in a sense, turns it around, and the photographer, the journalist, has so much more control than ever before. And as you rightly mentioned, the fact that we have a smartphone makes us as much a publisher as a reporter. And I think more significantly, and you've alluded to this, that we then become part of a community. So when I am reporting, I'm not reporting merely as me, I'm carrying with me my community. And I think that's a very powerful space to occupy. But to come back to your question, yes, certainly. I mean, when I first contacted you, we wrote longhand letters. Well, they were typed. Then we had telets, then we had fax. We actually introduced email to Bangladesh. But even that was not internet. So we had to use clever devices like Veronica and Gopher to teach people how to access the internet using email. But today, you know, this device is as much a publishing tool as anything else. And a farmer in the field often has a smartphone, which opens up tremendous possibilities. But to come back to the majority world photographer, I think the internet itself is such an enabling device. The fact that it can encompass pretty much all the media products, whether it be text, whether it be sound, whether it be film, whether it be slideshows. And today, when we come to what you're saying, you'll be talking about surround sound and things like that. But I just like to bring in the majority world perspective very shortly, because one thing that is true is with the majority world photographer, and in fact with the majority world citizen, when news is breaking, they are the people who are there at that time. And it doesn't really matter how great someone else somewhere else. The fact that I happen to be where the action is happening makes all the difference. Over to you.
Okay, well, I want to talk a little bit about now moving on from, I'm going back to showing the screen. So moving on from the description of what I feel as a multimedia journalist, this kind of brings me to this particular project that I want to talk about, which is Battleground PolyU. I'm going to go through a quick introduction to it and explain how I got to doing what I did and how I did it and why I did it. So let's start off, as I'm sure a lot of you know, that there was a series of protests in 2019, starting in June, in Hong Kong, that became not just every weekend, actually almost every day there were protests happening. And I, working from a newspaper based in Hong Kong, was called to help out with some of the coverage. I have some history or some experience in doing conflict before, but it just became a routine of going out with the gear. And this gave us a really kind of interesting opportunity also to try new techniques and to get better at the way that we were covering them from the very early days, because we were literally doing it almost 2 or 3 times a week. This is a picture of my standard gear here. You can see I have a long lens on my DSLR, which is over my shoulder. That I would do for any sort of anything that was any distance away from me. I had quite good reach on that lens, and I was able to take pictures quite quickly and make video and send it back to the office via my smartphone. And you'll see in my right hand there, I have a 360 camera, which I quite quickly learned early on that when things were happening all around you very fast, that just holding the 360 camera, one, was better for my own security because I could hold it up and I'd put my head down when things were flying around. So that was good, but also it meant that I could then quickly take that footage and edit it as a 16:9, your regular video format, and send that back to the office. But I could re-edit it. So if things were happening all around me, I had to be close to the action, but it meant that it captured everything. And then I had a chance to do that in post-production. I think I've got some pictures of me here. This is holding the 360 camera. I did switch. The previous one was a Insta360 camera. This is a GoPro, and that was a crucial part of that was the fact that this new camera had what we call Ambisonic or 360 sound, which is something I'm going to talk in a bit more detail. But just to go back to the protests, these were happening on a regular basis, as I said. And as you can see, all these people in the yellow vest in the background, this is all the press. There's also some on the bridge here. And we found ourselves here with live streamers going on, and sometimes just so many press, and it was very difficult to get something different than what everyone else was getting. I mean, everyone was pretty well there covering the events. It was also difficult not to get involved in the story. Here's on the right-hand side, you see a photographer being hit by a petrol bomb, then soon became the center of the story rather than this. This was a group of police trying to get through on a narrow passageway past the media, as you can see, almost an impossible task. And here you have instances again where you have just the media completely surrounding one person, giving a very kind of unrealistic. And this is also something that I was trying to avoid in the early days of being part of the story. I wanted to observe it. I wanted to report on what was happening. But I didn't want to give a sort of false impression of what was going on, but I also didn't want to become part of the story. So this little clip here, I don't know if you can see it. It is playing here. So this shows me in action with a 360 camera. But you can see the way I'm holding the camera. So I hope that gives you a sort of sense of what it was like, why I was using the 360 cam. When this stuff was happening all around me, all I had to do was to hold the camera, and then I could re-edit it later and just choose the parts that I wanted. But in this case, I re-edited it looking back at me, so you can see what it looks like from my perspective. I'd then take that footage, I'd go back, find a place, a quiet place, upload it to the phone, and then do an edit within the phone and send it out back to my desk from there. So let's move on to PolyU. This happened in November, and November, I think it started about the 15th, so not so, almost a year ago now. There had been a couple of incidences that had led to increased protests, and that also led to 5 universities being taken over by students. I happened to be away filming a documentary at the time. I was just finishing off a documentary. I rushed back, but I missed the first major university battle. But I was told that this one at PolyU was going to be big, mainly because they had occupied a university that was adjacent to a major highway, and they'd taken over the highway as well, which was a big thoroughfare in Hong Kong, disrupting a lot of life. The campuses that didn't disrupt much, the police tended to leave alone. But it got increasingly violent. There was a huge amount of people within inside. I stayed overnight in the campus waiting for something to happen. It started one night, and then we had a full day of ongoing battles, which I was filming with a 360 camera at the time, just as a means of being able to send back to the desk. These are some of the still images from those protests. The next day, I had to get out at night because my battery was going on my batteries were going on my cameras, and my cards were filling up. So I decided to make the choice to come out of the university. And then the next day I came back, and there was ongoing protests of people trying to break through the cordon and get the students out, by which time the students were all inside, or the protesters, should I say. These are some from the next day. And unfortunately, the final day, on the 5th day, I was able to get back into the university. And at that point, we saw a lot of the protesters starting to leave, as you see now, until it was not completely empty, but the vast majority had left by the time that I got out. So I had all of this footage, and what I hadn't realized at the time was this new camera had, as I said, what is called Ambisonic Sound. Now this gives you a spatial understanding of where you are, which is different from regular. So even if you have headphones on, as you turn your head with the 360 goggles on, the sound moves with you. So if something's happening in front of you, you see it in front of you, but if you turn your head around, it happens, you hear it from behind you. And this spatial sound really gave a much more kind of realistic sense of what was going on. The biggest problem that I've had, I decided to edit a film, which, as you know, has been very successful. It won the World Press Photo Digital Storytelling Interactive of the Year. And I was nominated for a Webby Award and been in lots of festivals and other things as well. But the problem that I've had is that you have to have the high quality goggles on to really kind of understand why it is such a powerful video. And very few people have had access to that because the technology has still not been very easy to get hold of. And we were talking about this with the majority world. I think, Shahidul, you've not been able to see it properly yet. I think you described your experience as being very fuzzy. And this has been a constant issue, even in the World Press Photo Exhibition, which has been on tour because of COVID. They've not been able to give people the headsets. So even in the exhibition, they can still see it on a screen, and they can kind of flick through it so they can move around, but it's not the real experience of having it on. So I'm hoping, or I believe that in time that this will be something that will be solved, and that as a historical record, it will be something that's very important. But it has been very frustrating, particularly given the fact that a lot of what I do is for, I try to get my stuff to as big an audience as possible. I want as many people to see what I'm doing. I want to try to impact change if I can. And therefore making it available to as many people is very important. I know from what you've been doing with Chobi Mello and all sorts of other things, it's very much at the heart of what you do at Pathshala is accessibility to the work that we do. And as I said, this has been one real frustration. But having said that, in terms of, we go right the way back to what we were talking about before in terms of being a multimedia journalist, it does give an incredibly realistic sense of what it was like to be there. And as a historical record, I'm convinced that people in the future are really going to get a better understanding of what actually happened during this particular protest, which was by far the biggest of all of the Hong Kong protests to date that we've seen in the last few years or so. So as a multimedia technology, it does do exactly that. It is the most appropriate way to tell the story. If you're thinking about the best way to tell the story, it's definitely not the most appropriate way if you want to reach the largest audience. And these are two very different things, of course.
Well, it's good that you mentioned that. I mean, I would also, as you mentioned, I had the problems, it looked fuzzy, and I wasn't really getting that immersive sound effect to maximum effect either. I was looking for it. But the fact that you're there, that immediacy of being there. And in a sense, that's what we try and do as journalists. We try and bring the audience to where we are. As a writer, as a photographer, we try and give a sense of being present. And there is nothing more than this immersive space that you can work within that gives you that opportunity. Hopefully, some of those things will change. But there are also other things I noticed which can be problematic in the sense that in a country like Bangladesh, for instance, if there's a conflict, there are usually three parties. They're the protesters, they're the government activists trying to attack the protesters, and there's the police trying to help the government activists beat up the protesters, and you're somewhere in between trying to deal with all this. So I can imagine, when you have a wide lens and you need to be right in the middle of things, and there's things flying in all directions, it's problematic.
So a lot of people have, the people who've seen it, a lot of the people at World Press, in fact, who saw it in its full high resolution definition, they found it problematic. They were asking me ethical questions about, it feels like you're in a computer game. It feels, are you worried about it being too realistic? And, my answer to them was that was not an ethical consideration at all for me. The biggest ethical consideration was exactly what you said, is that you have to be in very close proximity to what is happening to make this work. And if in any way this encourages people to get close to what could be very dangerous situations, and actually in the video you'll see that I'm very closely missed by two petrol bombs, one sort of midway through and one towards the end, that explode, literally within a matter of maybe 1 meter away from me. And I would very much hope that this doesn't encourage people to do things in that way. It does work because of its proximity. And I think Hong Kong protests, I've covered conflict in lots of places around the world, and relatively speaking, Hong Kong protests are reasonably safe for the journalists. As I said, that is big caveat here in compared to other places where it can be a lot more violent and you see the use of live rounds and all sorts of other things. So it was easier to get closer to the action, but it's not something I would recommend in a place where you feel endangered. That said, as I said, the one good advantage of it is that you can duck your head down and get yourself into a much safer position and hold the camera up, and it'd be the camera that gets shot or gets hit if there are projectiles and things flying around, and you're still able to film. Because it films in 360, you don't have to be literally looking through the viewfinder to see what you're filming. But I should say also, which I didn't mention before, that I had done a number of 360 projects before, and we were talking about appropriateness before, that I found it very difficult to find a really good appropriate reason for using 360. I've seen lots and lots of people try it with subjects, sort of slow moving documentary type subjects. And then the real question that comes back is, do you really, is there a great benefit for doing it in 360? Okay, yes, you're interviewing this person and you can turn around and see what's behind him, but do you really need to see what's behind him, kind of thing? We're just interested in what this person is talking about. And it was difficult to find new subjects, whereas this one, I think, was one that just completely hit the nail on the head, in that it was a place where you could immerse yourself and you could literally look everywhere and there are things are happening. There's also stories within the story. So as people watch it, they often watch it 2 or 3 times. And the second time they'll follow a character. So they'll see a character here who's maybe involved in the protest or a policeman, and then they'll turn their head and they'll just keep following that character and see what happens to them, which you can do. Whereas if it's just somebody running through your frame, you just get a brief instance of it. So there's a couple of times where you can see whether the protester got caught or they got away, or you can see where this person ended up in their chase. And I think that is kind of it adds to the storytelling, and it allows people to get different experiences of watching it. One of the things that when we set it up, we can set up all the gear for letting people view it with the headset on is we see what they're looking at, because on the computer screen you can see which direction they're looking at. And it's really frustrating. Sometimes you're looking at them and they're watching this and you say, look behind you, something's about to happen. It's almost like being in a pantomime. But that's only because I know I know what happens in the story. But yes, I mean, I would just go back to your initial question. I would say without a shadow of doubt, that this is not something that you should try and do unless you're sure that you can do it in reasonable safety.
But there is another aspect to it as well. I mean, I can tell from my end, I, like you, started off as a still photographer. I began to use the XM1 when I saw people doing interviews of me in XM1. I thought that was, in relative terms, a compact thing. Then I began to use the Flip. And what's interesting is the Flip was a 720 pixel camera. At the same time, the high-end Beta was also 720. And one was a $60,000 piece of equipment, another was a $35 equipment, because you could get, for $70, you could get two for the price of one.
I think you'll find that the Beta is actually less than 720. The Beta cam was in the old format, which is 576 by something. Yeah, so it was technically a better camera. And you still find that with phones these days, that quite often the phones will film at higher resolutions than what you're watching your National Geographic TV on or whatever. Yeah.
There is that, but there's also the fact that often when you're doing those productions, you work in a team. You have a sound recorder, you have a video person, you have several other things, and there are stories you simply cannot do in that way. The fact that you're a loner gives you an edge in ways that you would never have had you had to move. That inertia of moving with a team simply wouldn't allow you to be reactive in the same way as you are when you're on your. But there is. I'd just like to take it on. I think you work for multiple publications. You work for a group. There are several people, and perhaps one advantage also is that the same content can be repackaged for different publications which have different needs and different interests and different audiences. But converse to that, I am in a situation where I'm very concerned that mainstream media will not cover a lot of the things that I think need to be covered, because they have to play much more safe. They have to worry about government regulations. They're bureaucratic, and there are all those other conditions they need to think of. I, as an individual, can tell stories that many others would not do. And I think the multimedia component isn't merely true for multimedia journalists professionally, but also free practitioners and even citizen journalists.
Yes, and we've actually seen a lot of that in Hong Kong, as I showed you earlier. I mean, there's been a mass. I mean, sometimes it's problematic because you feel that there's too many press for what is going on. Maybe there's only a handful of protesters and there's a lot of media. But on the other hand, as you said, it's really given an opportunity to have this sort of wide diversity of different people telling stories from different angles. So you have a chance to tell the story in a very rounded way. And the PolyU story, I've had a lot of criticism about me missing things. They say, yeah, but this happened and this happened, and it's not represented in your film. But my response to that is that yes, that those things did happen, and there's lots of other people who caught it. But this is just my personal experience. I mean, that final film was actually, this was my 5 days during the PolyU siege, and this is what I witnessed, this is what I saw, and this was my take on it. But it's not the whole story, because I couldn't have been, I mean, it's a massive geographical area. I can't be everywhere the whole time. And also I got injured a couple of times. I got hit by the water cannon, and I got hit by some other projectiles. So I was out for small periods where I was sort of seeing to my injuries. And so, yeah, I mean, it is a personal thing. Sorry. That it's my story, but there were lots of other, and you can go online and you can see all the other angles and the other things that I didn't get.
Yes, but I think I'd like to move away from that. You are a storyteller. It's your story, and every person's story is different. I think two people in the same place with the same equipment might well have been telling very different stories depending on their inclinations, their politics, what they're interested in, what their skill sets are. All of that is valid. But I think I'd like to turn that around in a sense that that makes it that much more interesting for majority world photographers, because they are often people who know the community better, they know the language, they know the context, they understand the historical background. And there were those days when you used to have to, when there was a big story, you would fly in photographers from all over the place. It still happens. But today, I think the local photographer has an edge in many different ways. What we then need to do is to make sure that we harness the technology that's available and ensure that we can utilize these technological benefits that are there in order to be able to compete more effectively. And I think also it's a question of time. You know, when something's happening, there's a local photographer already there wherever a story is breaking.
Yeah.
And from a photo editor's point of view, if those pictures, and a day in a news cycle is a big time frame. Getting pictures out there a day, a couple of days earlier makes all the difference.
And it's a constant struggle. I mean, this is a really good point. I think you will remember Peter Fenton, who was at Pashala, I think, when he was doing his research. He put together this handbook of local photographers, and it was quite a thin publication at the time around the majority world. That has changed immensely now, that, as you said, that there are local photographers who are very able to take on international assignments pretty well anywhere in the world these days. But we do have this, it's not like the battle's been won now, because now we have this constant changing of technology. And so, as you said, that as we get newer technologies that arrive, and the, you know, some news organizations have to have it on this technology, that gives them that excuse still to need to send somebody out. So it's a constant catch up, really, to try to keep up to date with what's going on. I mean, I think, you know, that's really where places like Pashala and this particular course are essential, you know, that we have people who are being trained with the latest technology and trying it, even if it's not that accessible in the places that they're at the moment because of speeds of internet or other things. But, you know, I think everyone that's doing this course, you know, it is really important that you are not just learning how to do one thing right now, but you see it as a continually moving goalpost, that it's always going to be updated, and you have to keep your eye on it, and you have to update your skills and try and get hold of, or at least being able to use the new technologies when they come out, so we're not caught off guard as we were in the past.
Yeah, but it's also not simply a question of what's the best technology or most appropriate technology, but what's the most appropriate technology at this point in time. When you and I began to do the Rural Visual Journalism Network, that was in 2011. At that time, we used the iPod Touch. We did not have internet or any of those sort of things, but they were good cameras. You could use iMovie and edit on them, and they're still being used. And in fact, we found that in some cases, the iPod Touch still works better for certain situations. But of course, things have moved and things will continue to move, and you will get Chinese cheap smartphones, you'll get 5G and all that sort of thing. But I'll go back to what you're saying. I think it's also a question of never being able to, never sitting still. It's as the Queen would have said to Alice in Wonderland, it's a strange kind of country. Here, you have to walk just to stay still. To get anywhere, you've got to go twice as fast.
Very true, very true.
Okay, I think that gives a nice rounded summary to our audience, but there are many other resources available, and please do come back to these programs. There are a range of them, and we will be refining them and updating them as we go along, so we hope to see you there.
And I'll make sure there's a link to this film if you have a chance to watch it. It is on YouTube, so you can watch Battleground Poly on YouTube on a phone, definitely put headphones on if you don't have the 3D goggles. If you can get that, and the faster internet connection you'll have, the clearer signal it will deliver the higher resolution to you.
And hopefully we'll get rid of this virus, and DJ, you can come and visit Hotshot.
Yes, for sure.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Take care.